Hi everyone, this week of Freedom Advocacy, we'll be looking at the importance of property rights and find out what the Judicial Service Commission is. So stay tuned because we have a good show ahead. Hi everyone, welcome to Freedom Fanatics. This is a production of the Freedom Advocacy Network, and I'm Sholan. And this week I'm once again joined by Martin van Staden, who is a legislative and policy consultant for Sakeliga and the Free Market Foundation. Welcome back to the show, Martin. How are you?
I'm doing fine, thanks. Thank you for having me on again. It's great to be here.
Yeah, as always, I know we're going to have a great show, and thank you for making the time. Yeah, for sure.
Anytime.
And first, yeah, and first up, we will be looking at fans explain video, which highlights why your property rights matter. So let's quickly have we can have a quick watch.
What are property rights and why do they matter? Put simply, property rights are a way of agreeing who has what rights to which property. Imagine that you own a house in a society which does not have formal property rights. In such a society, you'd always have to stay close to your house to defend it, or else somebody could come along and simply take over your house or demolish it. You can't stop them by saying, "That's my property," because it won't really be. In contrast, a formal property right makes it clear that you are the owner of the house and that nobody may interfere with it without your permission, even when you are away. But clearly, property rights alone are not enough for you to control your property. You need someone to have your back when it comes to property rights. In most countries, this is the state. The state protects your property rights in three ways: through laws that establish the rules, courts that interpret and apply those rules, and police that protect your property, for example, when it is threatened by thieves, looters, or rioters. Individual property rights are vital because they form the foundation of personal freedom. They allow you to work for and earn wealth and protect yourself against economic risk and those who mean you harm, including the state itself. They are essential for building prosperous societies because they let you keep ownership of your property even when you're not near it. They allow you to change and improve it, sell it, and use it as collateral if you want to borrow money. Make no mistake, property rights are human rights. Protecting them is one of the most important functions of the state. You must ensure that your state protects your property rights and not undermine them. Your freedom is worth fighting for. Join FAN today to build a new tomorrow.
Yeah, Martin. So first up, something that usually frustrates me when the discussion is had about property rights and why it's important. The term property is usually framed around this context that that it refers to some piece of dry land in the Free State that's either being farmed or not being farmed. But we know that the term property is not only limited to land. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I mean you're totally correct. There's this phenomenon where if someone defends private property rights, particularly in South Africa, there's usually quite a few people who say, "But what about the people who don't own property?" Which is a nonsensical thing to say because everyone is a property owner. There is no such thing as someone who does not own property in South Africa. It doesn't exist. Private property is everything from your toothbrush to your house to the land that it stands on to your bank account, to your assets in the form of shares, for instance, if you're so inclined. Even sentimental, relatively worthless things that have no market value are property, and it's your property. And if you're found in a situation where legal protections for property rights are harmed, it's not only the landed property that is in danger, but really the older property. And we see this with government talking about prescribed assets, which targets pension funds. That's a very anti-private property approach that should be seen along with government's more land-focused anti-property policies. So there is no arbitrary distinction on what types of property. The fact is, property rights is a coherent whole, and it refers to the clothing on your back, the heirlooms that your family passes on, and also to land, of course, and to all your money that you have.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it links brilliant up to the next point that I wanted to raise, was that the greatest threat in South Africa right now, when it comes to property and property rights, is expropriation without compensation and prescribed assets as well, as you mentioned. And that's why, would you maybe just be able to explain to us about what expropriation without compensation is? Because it sounds nice. Yeah, it sounds very sophisticated. But just
Yeah.
explain to us what this policy is, and what are the ANC and EFF's intentions with this piece of legislation that they're trying to pass through Parliament, and what are some of the consequences? Where has this taken place in the world before?
Yeah, so I think we should start with the idea of expropriation. Now, this is a power that governments have had for centuries. It's not a. It is a very controversial and contentious power, but it's nothing new. Expropriation has always existed. But the thing is, so before I think somewhere in the 1600s, when a government wanted your property, it simply took it. The king of the government said, God has ordained me with the power to do what I want, and I'm going to take your property, and you're not going to get a cent for it, and you're penniless, you're poor, and you starve. Now, what happened during that time is the idea of expropriation came about, and this idea very basically says that government, if it wants your property, it needs to go through a legal process, and that is because we are individuals and communities and families with rights and interests, and government, in order to be properly constitutional, must follow a legal process so that everyone is subject to the same law. Just like I cannot just take your stuff, a government cannot just take your stuff either. And that's how the idea of expropriation came about. And as it came about, from the very start, from the word go, it has always been associated with the payment of compensation. There has never been an exception. Even though it wasn't necessarily written down in statutes, it was simply taken for granted for hundreds upon hundreds of years that if the government expropriates your property, you will get compensation. During the American Revolution, when the American Bill of Rights came into effect, they actually wrote it down. They said you must get compensation, and that became a trend that's been followed in most countries around the world. But even in those countries where it isn't written down, you are still entitled to compensation. And that brings me to this point. Expropriation without compensation is a contradiction in terms. There is no such thing. It cannot exist. If you're talking about expropriation, there necessarily has to be compensation. The moment you take compensation away, we are no longer dealing with expropriation. We are dealing with an arbitrary seizure or confiscation of property that is reminiscent of the days when kings and chiefs could just ride into town and say, I'm taking that property and I'm taking that property, and I didn't really care about your interests. So it's expropriation without compensation is a properly anti-constitutional phenomenon. Now, of course, the appeal to government for the South African government in particular for this is obvious. It saw that in Zimbabwe, where Robert Mugabe was threatened by his troops essentially rising up and saying, you're no longer paying us properly, there is no money, the economy has collapsed, what are you going to give us now? And the government said, okay, we're going to take land from people and we're going to give you land. Now, our government saw that, and Robert Mugabe stayed in power while his country collapsed. And our government sees that and thinks, hell, why not here? So our government, and particularly the EFF, which has venerated Robert Mugabe, they are very keen on this idea, regardless of the human suffering that has led to. And I mean, Zimbabwe is not the only example. We have Venezuela, where Hugo Chavez did the same thing. And there, the earlier point about property not simply being land comes through quite starkly. He did not just seize farms, he did seize farms, but not only. He also seized banks, he seized companies, and so forth. Paying little, if any, compensation to the owners, and that, of course, led to the collapse of the Venezuelan economy. There's people who are going to say, no, it's sanctions and whatever. That's the sanctions didn't fall out of thin air. There was a reason for it, and those reasons were these abuses of human rights and economic freedom. And Venezuela used to be a middle-income country, one of the most prosperous in South America. It is now one of the poorest states in the world, where people are eating their pets. They are invading zoos to eat zoo animals because they're starving, because the proper proprietary basis of their economy has been entirely destroyed. Now, in South Africa, the expropriation without compensation thing takes on about two forms currently. The most pressing one is that the ANC and the EFF have proposed a constitutional amendment to remove the right to receive compensation upon expropriation when your property is taken. That will be taken out and replaced with a very equivocal notion that you may receive compensation sometimes if it is deemed to be just and equitable. Currently, you will always receive compensation, no exception. It might be a lower compensation, it might be higher compensation, but you will always receive compensation. They want to change that and make it an equivocal, conditional situation by amending the constitution. They're also doing another thing. They want to allow government to essentially nationalize certain types of property that government will define for itself, and just nationalize that. And then the principle again applies: there may not be compensation at all. So that's the other thing that the constitutional amendment does. And then the second form of expropriation without compensation is the expropriation bill, which operationalizes this new reality, which basically sets out the procedure that government will go through to confiscate your property without paying you anything. And really, the expropriation bill makes that very easy for government. So the idea that only the right to compensation is falling away, but there's still legal safeguards and due process, so you'll still be protected by the law. That if the expropriation bill is adopted, that is not the legal protections don't go away entirely, but they are severely weakened. So it's going to be very, very easy for the government to say that property and that property. Now, to be totally fair, the expropriation bill does only apply to so-called land. It does not apply to bank accounts, to copyrights, and so forth, to intellectual property. It only applies to land. But land in South African property law means the land plus anything that is built on the land. The expropriation without compensation story applies to all fixed property: your house, your business, your factory. Anything that is built on land is going to be subject to this new principle that you may receive ZIP if the government wants to take that property. Now, that is, in short, what we're dealing with here. And as you rightly said, this has never worked anywhere. There is no example of a society being prosperous beyond primitive prosperity. A lot of people say, yes, there was the Great Zimbabwean Empire or something in hundreds of thousands of years ago, and it was a prosperous African empire. Yeah, the king might have been prosperous, and the chiefs might have been prosperous, and the GDP of the country might have been high, but ordinary people suffered because there was no formal conception of property rights the way we understand it today. So there is no exception to the rule that you need secure property rights for ordinary people like you and me to prosper. It has only been since the Industrial Revolution of about 200-300 years ago when this idea really solidified that us, the plebs, we also get to share in property, and in so doing build ourselves up from being subsistence farmers and hunter-gatherers and factory workers. We also get our own houses, our own businesses, our own cars, what have you. This has been the necessary ingredient for us to be to flourish. And without it, we've seen many countries try to go without it. Maoist China try to say, no, you don't need private property. Bring all the grain that you farm. Bring all the grain to the government, and we will decide who gets the grain. And hundreds of millions of people starved. We saw it in Ukraine. Millions starved. We saw it in the Soviet Union, whose economy could only really produce military hardware, but it could not produce the basics for ordinary people. We see it today in Zimbabwe, and we see it today in Venezuela. All the examples of prosperous countries that we want to aspire to are examples of countries where private property rights are secure. We cannot go without them.
Yeah, and Martin, something I just want to highlight before we end off is that we see, you mentioned the expropriation bill, and Dr. Anthea Jeffrey, who's actually the head of policy at the Institute of Race Relations, she actually made a warning in one of her recent articles, where she says that this will eventually allow the government to set up land courts, which will deal with expropriation without compensation matters, and these judges would eventually be appointed by the president, and the president will be advised by the Judicial Service Commission. And the Judicial Service Commission has been in the spotlight in recent weeks for many reasons. And can you just quickly essentially tell us what the Judicial Service Commission is, and what are some of your concerns about the procedures and the individuals who are on this commission? Yeah, just tell us some of your concerns.
Yeah, so the Judicial Service Commission is what I think to be one of the greatest constitutional mistakes South Africa has made. It's an institution created in the Constitution. Essentially, it is comprised of, I think, three groups of people: parliamentarians, lawyers from legal practice, academic lawyers, and then there's a fourth category, judges. There are also judges on it. So it's these four groups of people. The fundamental mistake in the commission is that the majority of the participants are political party members, employees, cadres from parliament. And what this body does is it interviews judges, and it at the end of the process, it compiles a little list, and it sends that list to the president, and the president appoints our judges from that list. This is for the Constitutional Court, the Supreme Court of Appeal, the High Courts, all of our courts except the magistrates' courts. Now, what happened recently with the commission is nothing unexpected. A lot of people are now really paying attention to it, but the fact of the matter is there has always been politicking and electioneering on the Judicial Services Commission, because it's another platform for people like Julius Malema to say how credentialed struggle revolutionaries they are. And the result of this is that very rarely do these politicians ask judges about, hey, how are you gonna what's your judicial philosophy, how are you gonna approach the law? That very rarely happens. They get asked about, are they racists? Are they sexists? How do they treat women in the office? And what do they think about quotas and so forth? That's what they talk about in the Judicial Services Commission. So it's a circus. It's a political circus, and not that it only recommends bad judges. We have many good judges in South Africa, but the fact is, our very best judges, that's probably going to become a narrowing group of people, and it might fizzle away entirely as more and more jurists simply don't want to be subjected to that abuse, and you have to go through that process. And now the land court, which the government has already proposed, the land court bill is currently in the pipelines. It will be thrown into this mix, and it's going to be even worse than what the Judicial Services Commission has produced up to now, because the land court bill exempts that court from certain rules of evidence. It allows hearsay evidence, so you don't have to produce actual proof anymore. For instance, if you say your land was taken 50 years ago, you don't have to necessarily prove that. You just have to say that, and the guy who currently has the land will be expropriated from them if the judge agrees. And the types of judges that the land court will get would not necessarily be people with experience as a judge in our tradition, in our legal tradition, but could include people from the Land Commission, could include people from the Department of Agriculture, could political deployees, and could include land activists, to be totally honest. Now, I'm not saying all the judges are going to be this. There might be exemplary great judges that are going to sit on the land court, but the point is the law is now going to make it very easy for us to get very problematic characters in this court. And really, the moment this whole system, expropriation without compensation, the land court, the Judicial Services Commission, all of this sets in and is entrenched, there's unfortunately very little protection for private property rights left. And the moment we go there, really all of our other rights and all of the other constitutional institutions that we have, welfare, democracy, education, all these things that we have rights to and that are protected by the Constitution, all of that really loses its substance. And we need to be very careful going down that route.
Yeah, absolutely, Martin. Thank you for your insight, man. It was absolutely brilliant. I love this discussion. And to our viewers, you can find all our written content, all of our explainer videos, all on our website, freedomadvocacy.net. And we've reached the end of this episode now. So don't forget to catch us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and IGTV. And to join FAN, you can support our fight for freedom and sign up at freedomadvocacy.net. And remember, guys, your freedom is worth fighting for.